Oh, I was muted in classical Zoom fashion there. Thanks for kicking us off, John. My name's JP Peterson, and I've been with Phone to Action for over 6 years now. So I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with many of you in attendance. I see some familiar names here. So thank you so much for joining. In my current role, I work hand in hand with Phone to Action's customer success team to make sure our clients get the very most value out of our relationship together. And today, I think we have a great deal of value to provide to all of you. We have three excellent client panelists here with us. Mary Kate Cunningham from American Society of Association Executives, Christina Sposo Telford from Edison Electric Institute, and Mike Watley from National Restaurant Association. They're going to be focusing their discussions on challenges they've overcome and future challenges that they're already preparing for. But prior to handing things off to our panelists, I wanted to spend a few minutes to provide some context for the webinar today and also to share a couple of trends. We thought now would be the perfect time for this webinar because as America emerges from the pandemic, I'm sure we can all expect there's going to be a great deal of change in the coming months. And so here at Phone to Action, we want to help you navigate this change. So we hope that you're going to be able to take away some actionable tactics and strategies to help the work that you do. Now, as we look to the future, there's a few major trends that we think are going to be at the forefront over the next few months that all of us will have to deal with and that our panelists are going to be touching on today. The first of which is that we saw an advocacy boom in 2020, like many of you, but there have been some signs of tapering engagement recently. In the first half of 2020, nearly 4 million new advocates joined Phone to Action's campaigns, which was nearly double the rate in 2018. However, the flood of new messages coming from organizations on a variety of topics has created a degree of advocate fatigue. With more competition than ever for people's eyes and minds, some advocates have felt overwhelmed and have slowed their participation as a result. The other main trend here is that our industry has an increased reliance on digital tools as a result of the pandemic. It's become clear that virtual solutions can replace in-person events to a degree. When it came to meetings with lawmakers, town halls, fly-ins, there were of course no other options in 2020. But even as things have started to open up and people have gotten together in person again, in-person events are being complemented virtually to boost participation in a cost-effective way. So one focus of today's discussion will be how best you can merge digital and in-person as the country continues opening up. And that's a good transition point for our first panelist, Mary Kate Cunningham. Mary Kate is the Senior VP of Public Policy at American Society of Association Executives. ASAE is a membership organization of more than 48,000 association execs and industry partners representing 7,400 organizations. Some of you in attendance might be members as well. Mary Kate is going to dive into what lies ahead for associations. Mary Kate, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here and talk about one of my favorite topics. How do you plan for the future during a really insane time for everyone? But so we've been at this kind of work from home for 15 months now, and I know folks are starting to go back to the office, but it's not uniform at all. And we don't know when we're going to get it to be able to go back to Congress to have meetings. So we're all figuring this out as we go. We are seeing some interesting trends on our side from ASAE. We have a lot of new research showing that our members are looking for advocacy more than ever. And I imagine that's the same for so many people. We had a huge crisis during COVID that we had to lobby to get remedied to keep associations afloat. I know other people, Mike and everyone else, they were in a real existential, fight for their members' survival during COVID. So that's increased. But then how do you keep up that momentum? I think that we've seen a big increase in interest that people remember why they've joined an association during a crisis. They joined for that advocacy and the community to come together. And really a big part of that is being able to have the tracking tools at the state and federal level and being able to find the contact information for for congressional staff. During this past year, I think I've all worked on issues that we've never worked on before. So it is sometimes new committees of jurisdiction, new contacts. And the best way that I think we've been able to make those new inroads are having the data about how our members exist in the state and federal level, the importance of our members to the district, and that's what's gotten us in the door. And talking about video and what we're all doing now, we know that everyone is saying it's here to stay. There's really interesting Public Affairs Council survey data from the last 2 months saying 87% of government affairs executives say video meetings will be increasingly common. It's going to be part of our daily life. And 46% claim that video calls can sometimes be more effective than face-to-face meetings. So I think we'll have both, and that is always a special challenge with fly-ins in particular. And I know every government affairs person has a love-hate relationship with fly-ins, but it could be much more effective if we can do in-person for our people that love to come to the Hill, and then also lower the barrier to entry, have folks from around the country that can't make it into DC also join. It is a scheduling special kind of nightmare, but I think it can make associations a lot more effective. That being said, as much as we talk about video, I don't think that it means I can move back to Scottsdale, where I'm from, quite yet, or a beach. I think that the business that we're in of advocacy, it's always the person with the best relationships wins. And so as soon as we're there are already some fundraisers in person that some have been happening over the past months. And those types of events, anytime you can go talk to congressional staff in person, we're all going to go and leap at that chance, because you build a much stronger relationship than I think on video. In thinking about the future of Association Government Affairs, we're also the question is, when are people going back to work? So I found it really interesting. We're hearing some GR shops are asking people to go back just when Congress is in session and then be work from home otherwise. But there are good signs. Members of Congress want to have people back and have meetings back in person. So even if it's late fall or if it gets pushed back, I think that it's something we're going to be able to return to. With giving security concerns and everything else, it's a really good sign, I think, that we'll be able to do that. Let's see. And I think this is the last point what we kind of mentioned, but when we're talking about reaching out to congressional staff here, we say this all the time, but it seems to just be getting worse how busy congressional staffers are. And Zoom is great, but also they're back-to-back meetings and, fighting to stay afloat. So more than ever, we're trying to make our ask to the point and extremely clear, because I think you've really got to feel for folks on the Hill right now. It's a really tough environment. So but the tools that we use like this are extremely useful. So I'm more thinking about the future of Association Government Affairs. I'm more positive than I was a few months ago, and look forward to hearing from the other colleagues.
Thanks, Mary Kate. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few weeks and the information we get from the Hill. So thanks for that. Our next speaker is Christine Helfer. Christine is Senior Director of Public Affairs at Edison Electric Institute, the trade association for the electric power industry. Christine's done an excellent job finding new ways to connect with EEI's advocates. And I'll let you talk about some of those new ways you've been able to connect with your advocates. Christine, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, JP. Thanks, John. Thank you, Phone to Action, for having me. I love telling the story of what we've been working on, since the pandemic. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As JP mentioned, we're the National Trade Association for the electric power industry. So our member companies are across the country. In fact, they're in all 50 states, supporting more than 220 million customers across the country. And so, your electric company is very local. And as such, our team, the external affairs team at EEI, we often call ourselves the traveling roadshow because we're a team of about 7 or 8 people that were constantly on the road, going to state legislative conferences, trying to do outreach from elected officials, everyone from, governors all the way down to city councils. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of time on the road, trying to get face time with policymakers. And so when the pandemic put travel on hold, we had to get creative. And JP, you can actually move to the next slide. We had to get creative, right? So we weren't getting that face time we would normally get with our stakeholders. And so we thought, okay, we have a lot of information to share with regard to how our industry is responding to this pandemic. What is the best way to get that information out there in a way that's easily digestible and can, get our message across in easy fashion. And so, like many organizations, we pulled together a podcast. The podcast is called The Current. It is hosted by my boss and our Vice President of External Affairs, Brad Viator, through our platform called We Stand for Energy. We Stand for Energy is our nationwide grassroots program that is a project of EEI. And so we launched this podcast, and initially probably the first 4 to 5 episodes were focused on exactly what I said, how we are responding to this pandemic, everything from how line workers are using PPE out in the field, how are we handling resilience, how are companies handling resiliency of power plants and things of that nature. And so that went on probably from when the podcast first started in late April 2020 through the summer. We had a steady content calendar kind of telling that story of our role in the pandemic. One of the things that kind of shifted, as indicated in the second bullet, was around the end of the summer, we thought, okay, this pandemic is going on a little bit longer than we had hoped for. And not that we had run out of content and messages to share with our audiences, but we thought, this is a great platform. We're getting pretty good traction with it. Let's start telling stories about our industry. Like, let's expand it. There are other timely topics that we can share, everything from electric vehicles to clean energy infrastructure, pretty much anything under the sun that we wanted to talk about. So, we expanded it to not target not just policymakers, but a much wider audience, including our base of advocates through We Stand for Energy. And so you'll notice if you go to our podcast on westandforenergy.com, or it's available in the iTunes and Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts, you'll notice that the topics kind of expand going into episode probably 10 or 12. And so that's when we started tackling all these other issues. And one of the things we did very thoughtfully in that was, okay, let's talk about other issues, but let's make sure they align with our policy priorities. And so 2 things that I'll give examples of here. One, on the federal level, is the LIHEAP program. This was a very important program to our industry, particularly during the pandemic, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Obviously, many Americans were out of work, struggling to pay their utility bills. So this program became increasingly important to our customers. And so we were huge proponents of it. We did an episode explaining what is LIHEAP, why is it important. We interviewed the head of an organization that their whole purpose is to advocate in favor of LIHEAP funding and expansion. And so we used that episode, promoted it on social media through Facebook and other promotional means to really start educating our advocacy audience and other demographics that might be of interest. And then after that, you can actually move to the next slide, GP. We overlaid our call to action with that audience who should have gotten the podcast. And so, in an ideal world, they would have listened to the podcast and then received a call to action either through Facebook or Twitter or wherever they're receiving our ads to send a letter to Congress in support of an expanded LIHEAP program. The other example I gave is at the state level, and that was in Missouri. So similarly, another policy priority for our industry is our company's ability to participate in the middle mile broadband space. So being able to use our existing energy infrastructure to partner with telecommunications companies and expand broadband to rural areas and underserved areas, which, as you can imagine, is paramount at this point when all of us are doing work from home and school from home. And so similarly, we did an episode highlighting one of our member companies that is truly a leader in this space, Ameren Missouri, who has put forward a pretty robust program in broadband expansion. So we interviewed their chief technology officer, again, promoted that in Missouri. And then several weeks later, once the bill in Missouri was introduced that would allow investor-owned utilities to participate in that space, again, we overlaid that targeting. So those people who listen to the podcast ideally would have gotten the call to action to weigh in with their state senator. And so it was kind of a 1-2 punch there. And JP, you can actually move to the next slide. And so, I outline a couple results here. We had a good number of impressions with both campaigns. I will say proudly with the federal LIHEAP program campaign, this was actually the most impressive campaign we've done through We Stand for Energy, generating more than 46,000 letters to members of Congress, and happy to report that increased LIHEAP funding was included in the supplemental COVID package. So that was good. As far as the Missouri campaign, you'll see again a good number of podcast impressions, good number of downloads, generating nearly 200 letters to the Missouri Senate, which might not sound like a lot, but these state senators, these state legislators, when they get more than 5 letters, they start to turn their heads. So we were pretty impressed with that. So that's one way that we got creative and pivoted, using a new tactic through podcasts to overlay with our existing tools through phone to action. And with that, JP, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I think that's such a great story. It seems like so simple and natural, but I feel like oftentimes difficult to make those decisions. And so I think you did a really good job at identifying, a natural pivot that you could make to achieve a successful outcome. So thanks for sharing. So our final speaker is going to be Mike Quatley, who is the VP of State Affairs and Grassroots Advocacy at the National Restaurant Association. So as you can imagine, Mike has had his hands full this past year. Given the substantial impact of COVID on the restaurant industry, Mike's had his finger on the pulse of advocate engagement across the country, and he'll spend a few minutes touching on the important ways you can fuel post-pandemic advocacy engagement. Take it from here, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, JP and John, for having me and for letting us tell our story. The National Restaurant Association is the trade association that represents the restaurant industry across America. And we are fortunate to have 52 state restaurant associations as well. So we're in every single community. And the pandemic has touched every single lever of government, starting from federal government, state governments to local government. So our big challenge going forward is, from March of 2020 until now, we just had an absolute crush of advocates who came to us. Our metrics it's not 2 or 3 times. We're talking 10 times the number of advocates that we used to have. We sent over 1 million emails to lawmakers last year, which is just incredible given where we used to be. But what do we do now? How do we take those folks who engaged with us and engage with us for probably one of 2 reasons initially? One, concern about a state government shutting their restaurant down because of COVID pandemic health and safety necessities, or was asking the federal government to help provide relief money. Due to our efforts and the efforts of a lot of different folks in the restaurant industry, you had Congress allocating money for PPP round 1, round 2, now the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. So a lot of attention on the federal government helping out restaurants. So you had folks who were coming to us for, please don't shut me down. And then folks coming for, we need recovery money because we've been shut down, which are 2, very motivating factors to get someone to engage. Also, a lot of our restaurant members aren't sitting in front of a computer every day. They're busy, they're on the move, they're potentially engaging through their cell phone. So now that the country has reopened, which is a great thing for restaurants, but also society as a whole, how do we keep the attention of our advocates? And so we've looked at a couple of different ways. And a big component of that is segmenting, figuring out who these literally hundreds of thousands of new advocates are, figuring out why they engage with us, and then tailoring specific communications to them based upon their behaviors and interests. So, you have to be segmenting. You have to be figuring out how to target as best you can. And this is a work in progress for us. I would say, we're in the first quarter of figuring this out. There's a lot more to do here. But we have a lot of data on why folks engaged and figuring out how we can tailor communications to them. And there's some folks who engage with us in the height of the pandemic, customers, for example, who probably aren't going to engage with us in the future, and that's okay. But figuring out, who in our database are those kind of super advocates that we can engage with going forward. So starting with your most engaged, I think the next bullet is, looking at the least engaged, and it's okay if people unsubscribe. They can leave your listserv if it's not relevant content to them. It was great they engaged to begin with, but going forward, you may not need them, may not be reaching them. And then our final bullet here, measure expectations with leadership. It's great that our email list went from being where it was about 8 times overall. That's unrealistic to happen again. There are only so many restaurant operators or restaurant employees or restaurant customers out there. Hopefully we'll never experience a global pandemic again in our lifetimes, but that is perhaps the most motivating thing that possibly could have happened. It's just unrealistic to think you're going to have that many folks come in new again. So being realistic with expectations. On our next slide, we have an example of our email that goes to everyone. So we send this out about once a week. This is the most recent example. It's just an update of what's happening in the industry. My boss, Sean Kennedy, about a year ago, had the idea to create these 90-second update videos where he, in 90 seconds, he usually goes a little bit longer than that, will go through what's happening in DC or in a relevant state in a way that matters to restaurateurs. So it's not reading Politico, it's really going deeper than that for operators in terms of why it matters and why they should get engaged. We utilize these emails and these alerts to drive engagement to our current priority. So this email goes to everyone. If you've opted in, you're going to receive this email. If we go on to the next slide, this is a more tailored email we've done in the past. So we spent a lot of time trying to segment and target. I know Phone to Action has rolled out a bunch of brand new tools for segmenting and targeting, which we're excited to start experimenting with in the next couple of weeks internally for us. But at the height of the pandemic, this was us utilizing a convo campaign, which for those of you who haven't utilized it, forces you to tell your story, forces you to customize your email. We then had people, many members of my team did a really awesome job, spent a lot of time going through this, reading those responses, thousands of them, and saying, okay, this person's an operator, this person's a customer, this person's an employee, this person's an other. And then we segmented based upon this. So this email, which went out earlier this year, goes to operators. And it's not asking them to take action and send an email to Congress. It's asking, how's your business? What's going on? Can you tell us what's impacting you currently? And we sent this email just to operators. And because of that, it has an insanely high open rate because it's very targeted in that regard. I mentioned we're in the first quarter of figuring out how to segment like this, how to target like this. But this is where we want to get to. We have the larger email that goes to everyone. But if we have a specific ask for operators, it goes to them. If we have a specific ask for restaurant employees, it goes to them. If we have a specific ask for customers, it goes to them as well. If we can go on to the next slide. So I mentioned it has a very high open rate. So our operator email, and it's small to begin with because we kind of tagged those folks probably about 8 months ago at this point. So it's thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but the email open rate is over 35%. It's almost crested 40% at times, which is very, very high because these are folks who are clearly operators and who clearly value what we're getting at. And the data they give us is very valuable because they're legit, they're operators. You're not sending it out to a very large email list where someone could be just clicking through it. These are people who've basically self-selected or we've identified they are operators. Something that we're working on is creating a tag for super advocates. So we created a metric of if we've sent 10 action alerts in the last 6 months, are there folks who have taken action 9 out of 10 times or 10 out of 10 times? And those are our super advocates. Those are people who pretty much regardless of what you're asking are going to take action. We're in the early stages of developing a kind of grass tops program. It's larger than just this, but this is a helpful component of there are a lot of folks who we'd never engaged with prior to the pandemic and who may not be members of our state associations who came in through one of our early action alerts and have shown extreme interest in taking action. So is there an opportunity to build them up into a grass top leader? And that's something that we're working on right now. And then also, you have to be creative and figure out different outlets. So one thing that we did in the fall of last year, many of you probably took advantage of outdoor dining. And a big component of our push was getting lawmakers to help allocate funds. This is the local level. Allocate funds to help restaurants winterize their patios. So Mayor Bowser in DC was perhaps the best example of this. They allocated about $6,000 per restaurateur to help with tables, tents and space heaters. And this was huge because it allowed operators to extend their patio season by a good bit. We got creative here and sent out a call to action through phone to action, asking operators to tell their story via video and submit stories to us for why outdoor dining mattered. And they were very raw, very honest stories that were told. We had one operator who was standing kind of at the foot of the Rocky Mountains on her patio in like ski clothing, basically saying, we had snow last week, and because of that, it shut my patio down. This is why it's so important for us to be able to winterize our patio, to take advantage of every day we possibly can. And we stitched all of that together into a video that basically was a call to action to all local lawmakers of help us keep patios open for as long as possible. It was really raw footage. I think pre-pandemic, you probably could not have put that out because it was low quality from a video perspective. But in the pandemic era and the post-pandemic era, video quality, it's taken for granted. I mean, you can utilize cell phone video, you can utilize tablet video. You don't have to have a professional crew out there the way we think of it in terms of like setting up lighting and microphones. It can be real fast footage that you can then put together into a larger video, which we utilize. So overall, just thinking up creative ways to engage folks who might not engage on your standard action alert, but who might engage on a more creative one where it's not sending an email, it's just uploading video. And we saw that be really successful in the pandemic. I believe that is it for this slide and overall. Turn it back to JP.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Mike. I love the practical examples of tagging. I always say the key to personalization is effective tagging and filtering. So I just love that. And then the emphasis on video, I think, is really important. And that's one theme that I've taken away from this presentation is that video is here to stay, whether that's, grabbing videos from advocates or, taking videos to share with your advocates. It's definitely an important communications channel that everyone needs to start thinking of. So I think we'll have some more questions about video in the Q&A section. But before we turn it over to Q&A, I did also quickly want to share that Phone to Action is not just an advocacy company. We recently acquired GovPredict and KnowWho to provide the best all-in-one government affairs platform. And now we're able to provide our clients with technology to run advocacy campaigns, track and coordinate on legislation, and identify the right decision makers with the deepest legislator and staffer contact data sets. So for those of you that are on the webinar right now, if you're interested in learning more about any of these new tools, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to discuss with you. Excellent. And now to the fun part of the presentation, the Q&A. So if anyone has a question, please submit those questions. You should see the Q&A boxes. These questions can be about anything. They can be specific, general. These are for you to get the value you feel like you need. I guess to start things off, a natural segue is really to the points that were made about, sort of new forms of media and engagement, video being one of them, podcasts being another. I guess for an organization that has been pretty traditional, what advice would any of you give to helping someone make the case internally that these are things we need to be doing? Like, how are those conversations going on your teams? And this can be for anyone.
I think it's meeting your advocates where they are. Like Mike talked about, his folks are not just at their laptop all day. And you see that with so many professions, and we're all glued to our phones. So if we've been trying to find ways, how can we have some complex tax issues, unrelated business income tax is not super intuitive. So how can we use social media to help explain that to association professionals who may not be totally in the weeds?
I would say on our team, we traditionally with video, we have a videographer on staff. You would send out a video crew and do the lights and do everything. And during the pandemic, you couldn't do that. So we just experimented, and there's a lot of experimentation in the pandemic. Some things worked, some things didn't, but for that, it did work. And I think also providing examples of others who are doing it, if you can, shows that, look, others are doing it. We can try this and see how it works.
I'd add, to Mike's point about previously you'd send out a video crew, right? There's so many powerful things we can do now with the smartphone and just with our laptops. I think we've proven that in the pandemic. People are shocked when I tell them we record our podcast on Zoom, and just having a good quality microphone makes it pretty easy to record these things and edit them. And so it's not a high cost. So if that's your pushback, I think a lot of these things can be solved with just the great technology that's accessible to us now.
Excellent. And another question that just came in, this is for you, Christine. On the podcast, what kind of metrics do you have on policymakers or staff listening? And then I'll add on to that question, what kind of metrics are you capturing on the public listening as well? And how is that informing, your enhancements of the podcast going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be honest, it's difficult for us to capture metrics on specifically policymakers and staff, just because through our hosting platform, the analytics don't get that granular. As far as general public analytics, that's pretty easy. So we use a hosting platform that tells us how many downloads per episode, which episodes are the most listened to, our top 10, and it gives us a nice little graph with, when people download and then when it slows down and up and down. So, as far as public metrics, those are pretty easily accessible. We're still figuring out the best way to measure, I would say, the public policy and stakeholder listenership.
Great. Looks like we had another question come in. They're coming in now. I think you might be able to answer this, but before you had action tools, how did you engage your audience or members? How did you make the case for a need for advocacy tools? So I think all of you probably had some advocacy tools. Maybe they were a little bit older, some of the older platforms. Like how did you make the case to scale up your advocacy program? And then it seems like this person might be at a smaller association. If you were in the shoes of someone at a smaller association, how would you make that case as well?
I would say we consolidated things. So prior to the pandemic, we did not use Phone to Action's emailer. We used a different company's emailer, and it was two different systems. So we consolidated it. I was not paid to say this, but Phone to Action has a great ability to kind of consolidate things for you, which is nice. We use it as a database. We use it as our emailer. We use it as our action alert. So I think overall, it definitely adds synergies versus having an emailer and a grassroots platform and a database. It was for us, we can make the case of, look, centralizing all of this makes it a lot easier for us going forward. Because the National Restaurant Association is a very big enterprise. We are the voice of the restaurant industry. So there are a billion different things we do, but having an advocacy specific platform and a way to communicate was key for us.
I would say for us, very similar to Mike in that it consolidated a lot of services for us. The other selling point for us internally was that under kind of the previous arrangement with our grassroots tools, it was all handled by an outside consultant. So we were paying a non-EEI consultant to manage all of it for us, including setting up ads, sending emails, et cetera. And my desire was to bring that in-house so that we had a little bit more control and faster reporting of results. And so that was a big selling point, was able to bring that in-house and cut some costs and make us a little bit more responsive to our members.
And one thing we've thought about is with all of advocacy, you need the function before the crisis. It's not something you can build out afterwards, or it's really difficult to. So that's part of the argument too.
Excellent. So we'll take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. Here's one. I work for a trade association with only corporate members, making advocacy more difficult. Our advocates are the C-suite in an organization. What are some ways we can motivate our member companies to get their employees and others involved as well? I don't know who's
$1 million question.
Pretty general, but I think, I don't know, if we can try to think of something specific, a tangible specific to provide.
Yeah, we definitely hear this from a lot of our trade association members. And unfortunately, it comes down to if it's a big enough crisis, they are motivated to weigh in, but you are competing with also the government affairs of the company as well for their own priorities. So it's not a challenge that you're facing alone. Everyone is.
I would say from EEI's perspective, larger federal fights are pretty easy to get all of our members on board, right? Because we're kind of their, like I said, everyone's locally based, so we're kind of their DC, one of their major DC voices, if you will. So that isn't difficult. I would say when it comes to more of those local state-based fights, we act almost like an extra consultant for them. So it kind of walking them through maybe how to set up a phone to action style call to action page, or learning how to use some of these digital tools that maybe they hadn't used previously in more of these local battles.
We're almost the opposite. It's easier for us to engage at the local level at times than the state level because we have a state association in every state. And at least prior to the pandemic, a lot of our larger congressional fights were more because Congress wasn't passing a lot of legislation. It was hard to get folks to engage a ton, but at the state and local level for restaurants, I mean, was all kinds of stuff happening. So I think for us, a decent part of it is finding advocates at the local level and then building them up to the federal level. And we also, while we have large national members, so many of our members are single unit operators. So somewhat hard for us to get into that part because our membership is so diverse, but for us, it was just making it as personal as possible and showing why it matters to get involved.
Got it. And then something that just came to my mind is we spoke a lot about, how to grab our advocates' attention and how to grab legislators' attention. The other piece is obviously, how do we grab staffers' attention? And so I guess, a general question for the three of you would be, there's always there's a huge pipeline of staffers coming to the Hill. Are you noticing anything different in how you need to engage with staffers as we've gone through the pandemic and are now emerging? Or is there anything else you're trying right now as you look to getting on staffers' radars?
Just thinking of wrong answers only would be great to that question. But increasingly just the research. I went back to my first reception on the Hill and it was amazing. Just being able to talk to people in person, like that's, I think, how we'll get through to people. But to having your advocates in the state and the district that can do the talking for you if you don't have the relationship with that office.
Excellent. We'll take one more and then I have a final question. So Morgan asks, when using these tools, how do you balance important issues versus too much contact engagement. So like, are you just monitoring those open rates? And if you see, say Mike, you've created a specific, segment in your database, you send out a few emails, maybe an email a month later, and you see that those open rates aren't as high as they were. Are you changing the frequency at which you're sending communications? How are you going about that balance?
We kind of on the end of last year, we started, I think, sending out a few too many emails a week. During the pandemic, we were sending out, during the height of the initial part of the pandemic, we were sending out so many emails because there was so much information out there. And it was so timely that I think as a whole, we just thought we would keep on sending more emails. And as the country began to reopen, our open rates began to dip a little bit when we were sending out too many emails. So we've come to the point of, it's one email a week is ideal. If we have to do 2, that's okay. We once did 3 and it was just like, it just fell right off. So I think we just are cognizant of how many we send out. And I think I mentioned we're early on in the segmenting process. I think as we get better at that and as we get further along, if someone came along, if we were able to identify what issues you care about the most, and there's like an EU tariff issue on wine, which is huge for us, we could then send it to folks who'd self-selected in, I want to learn about this. We're not there yet. I would love to get there. Hopefully we will at some point. But right now we just don't have the specificity to kind of micro segment at that level. But that'd be the ideal way, is to know what people actually care about and then to send them relevant emails. We're just not there yet.
So for us, segmenting is really important. So the example I gave with LIHEAP, the low income home energy assistance program, we do a call to action on that issue every year to advocate for its existence in the appropriations bill. And so when we did our big LIHEAP push during the pandemic, we went back and segmented that audience. Who has taken action on this in years past? And that's kind of where we started with our initial push with it, right? Sending an email out and a call to action out to them. And then also taking that audience and creating a lookalike audience on Facebook and targeting people that look like them with this, again, with the podcast and then with the lead ad. So segmenting for us is really important to making sure that people don't get burned out on content.
And on the other side, maybe at the end of this year or towards the election, it could be a little slower, and we still sometimes have to find things to send to the grassroots because you do want to keep them awake during slow periods as well. And sometimes we are being creative with what we ask them to do.
So I feel like I have a billion questions to ask, and so I'm going to throw in a few of mine, and then I promise we're going to wrap it up. But I'm really curious to hear more about your podcast, Christine. So like, it seemed like that pivot was almost natural. Was it as natural as you made it seem? And like, has that caused you to rethink other ways, other pivots you could maybe make elsewhere in your program?
Yeah, I mean, it was natural in the sense that a lot of the topics we put into our content calendar are the same topics we would be discussing at the various state legislative groups we participate in, whether it's National Conference of State Legislators, Council of State Governments, et cetera. We would be working with these organizations to organize educational panels to educate legislators on these topics. So it's just taking those, taking what conversation would have existed there and condensing it into a 15-minute podcast interview for my boss to interview like the right people on that topic. So it was relatively natural. Honestly, the hardest part was figuring out the logistics. So like I said, we recorded on Zoom, which sounds pretty easy, but we were like, okay, what mics do we need to order? Like, do we need to make sure the interviewees have the right mics? And so making sure that the sound quality was the best we could get, because we know that if you have poor sound quality on a podcast, it's so distracting, people just don't listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more of the logistics that I think was an initial challenge for us, but we got that, we got that tied down pretty easily.
So when you started running the Facebook lead ads,
Mm-hmm.
what was the actual ad you were serving up? Were you then linking to past podcasts that have been completed? Were they forms to sign up? What were those ads?
So the initial ad that our audience would receive is just a boost and post about the podcast, right? So we knew, let's take Missouri for an example. We knew that there was going to be legislation coming up in Missouri. And so we chose to boost the podcast in Missouri in specific geographic areas to just kind of like start warming that audience, get it on their radar, start educating them in the event that they have a spare 10 minutes to learn about why electric companies are vital to expanding broadband. So that was the first step. And then once the bill was introduced and moved to a point at which we needed to do a call to action, we put together the lead ad, overlaid it with that audience we had already targeted with the podcast to start generating those contacts into the state Senate. As you know, as for all of us who have used the phone to action platform, we know that everyone who has taken action gets an automatic follow-up email from us. And so, you know, it would always automatically tell folks who have taken action, you know, please visit us at westandforenergy.com, check out our podcast, et cetera. And so that's kind of how we linked the two, if you will. It was really overlaying that audience, making sure that those who heard the podcast also got served the lead ad.
Excellent. And then final question. So we spoke a lot about advocate fatigue. I wanted to introduce a new term to everyone on the webinar, which is advocacy professional or government affairs professional fatigue. I wanted to go around the table, and it's obviously been a difficult year. What's one thing each of you, either just something you do like working out or whatever, what's one thing you do to avoid the fatigue that comes with working in our industry? And it's more of a personal question, so my apologies.
Well, I have to say, obviously, Peloton. And my name is Peloton Lobbyist on Peloton. But also the Just Have K Street Instagram account is fantastic for Association Government Relations. It's a mystery who runs it, but it's just very funny, and everyone will identify with all the plight of our issues.
I would second the Peloton. Got one in September. It's been great. But also for us, it's a totally new issue set for me. Been here, I've been at the association for 8 years, and I mean, our biggest thing one of our biggest things this past year has been cocktails to go legislation. Probably the most significant change to state alcohol policy since prohibition, to be honest.
Thank you for that, by the way.
It's a fun topic to talk about. You're talking about margaritas. You're talking about alcohol to go. I mean, it's just that in particular has been interesting for me, and just a total like side shoot of the pandemic that probably would have taken 10 years to happen in a non-pandemic environment, and will be a huge thing for our members going forward. And also this is kind of interesting.
I would say for me, you'll get vote number 3 for the Peloton. So sorry, John and JP, I don't think you wanted this to be a Peloton ad, but you've got 3 Peloton fans here. So that's one. For me, the fatigue is really the screen fatigue and all the work, you know, we've been doing virtually. So anything that gets me away from the screen, whether it's just, you know, being outdoors and hanging out with my dogs outside, anything away from the screen is a good activity.
Perfect. Well, I'd like to thank all 3 of you. It was really great learning about you know, the different tactics you've used and how you've overcome some of these challenges. When we exit the webinar, there will be a survey, and for all attendees that are on the webinar right now, if you could please fill out the survey, let us know how we did. We're always looking for feedback to improve, you know, the community that we've built here of some of these amazing clients that you've heard here today. So thanks everyone for your time. Thank you to the panelists. We very much appreciate it, and have a great rest of your Tuesday, everyone.